side, there were several occasions where through essentially persuasion and sometimes stronger means would put measures in place to try and select their own choice of king, their own choice of emperor, knowing that if that particular king or emperor was under their control, the church would find it easier to carry on its own activities. So essentially there was a power struggle between the two. And it reached a point where, out of reason, both Pope Calixtus and Henry IV decided to sit down and try and come up with a sort of treaty, an agreement where they would state exactly what it is that the church is allowed to do in terms of state affairs and what the state is allowed to do in terms of church affairs. And out of this agreement, which we call the Concordat of Worms, which Worms being a city in northern Germany, also known as the Pactum Calixtum, out of this agreement, there was a sort of balance that was held. It was an uneasy balance, but it was the first step towards what we have today, the proper understanding that we have today of that separation of church and state, knowing that they are separate, yes, but keeping in mind that there's supposed to be collaboration between the two. And that agreement led to now the First Lateran Council, where the agreement was officially ratified. That is essentially what we had in mind when we came up with the concept of the symposium. Related to that, because understanding medieval church history, it's always important to look at the art of the time, because human beings always require something visual, something tangible to really bring home a particular message. So that is why we organized the exhibition related to the theme, which you can see around us and behind us, where we selected particular paintings and particular texts that help to bring to light the theme of the symposium and help us understand better the actual lessons in history that we can gain from the First Lateran Council and from the Black Death pandemic. At this point, if there are any questions, could attempt to answer some of them, and then we can return the mic to our capable dean. Yes, thank you.
My name is Faris from the KBC. I was asking, perhaps now, given the history of the Black Death and the pandemic that we've just come out of, perhaps now going forward, what can the church do in its own capacity to try and preach the message of how not only just Christians but everyone can just go over the pandemics, like how do we deal with them, how do we deal with the issues that come out of them, the mental states of people and all that.
Thank you for that question. I would say maybe we could look at it from two perspectives. On one side, there are lessons we can gain from how the church went about the Black Death pandemic from a medical point of view. One of the major interventions that was attempted during that time to try and stem the tide of death. There was no real cure, as we know right now. At the time, unfortunately, the doctors in the Middle Ages did not have a proper understanding of bacteria, which we now know, which caused the Black Death. So they had to come up with their own ways to try and solve the problem. One particular intervention, as I've mentioned, was the introduction of the quarantine. Throughout human history, there has always been the idea that, yes, once someone has fallen sick, and if they are around other people, it's likely that those around them will also get sick. But the proper enforcement of a quarantine, particularly by the state, only began during the Black Death pandemic, where we have countries such as Poland, which is uniquely one of the only European countries that ended up not suffering great losses due to the Black Death, precisely because the king at the time, Casimir the Great, enforced a statewide or nationwide boundary quarantine, where anyone within the country was not allowed to step outside the boundaries, and anyone attempting to come in was unfortunately left out. But in his mind, he wanted to protect his people. And because of those strict measures, Poland ended up surviving a great deal of the pandemic. So in one sense, when you look at today's world, of course, over the past 2 years, we've had various arguments speaking both about the pros and the cons of the various quarantine and lockdown measures that have been executed by various countries all over the world. But speaking from a strictly medical point of view and looking at how such measures help the Black Death, while there will always be some unfortunate compromises you might have to make, for the greater good, the lockdowns and the quarantines do actually help. On the second point, relating how people within the post-pandemic world can learn to interact, one unfortunate instance that the death pandemic is precisely because the doctors did not understand what caused the pandemic. The common Christian, the lay person in the ground, on the streets, needed to find someone to blame because they couldn't understand why their family, their loved ones, their friends were all dying in such unfortunate and gruesome ways. And
those are members of the clergy. They're giving a